The kindred of Kroot had always been regarded with a mixture of awe and trepidation even by other Kroot, a testament to their unsettling specialization. Their homeworld, a verdant orb known only as Kara to the Kroot, was a place of perpetual mist and colossal fungal forests, a perfect hunting ground for the apex predators of the galaxy. Unlike many kindreds who hired themselves out as mercenaries to the Toe Empire or lesser alien races, the kindred of Kroot pursued a more esoteric diet. They hunted the psychic, not the crude, volatile manifestations of raw warp energy, but the subtle, intricate nuances of those xeno species who wielded the Empyrean as a tool. Their quills, instead of dull bone or hardened keratin, shimmered with a faint, iridescent sheen, a legacy of generations spent devouring the brains and nervous systems of nascent psychers, of human-sanctioned psychers unfortunate enough to fall into their clutches, or of minor xeno-sorcerers. It was this unnerving predilection that set them apart. While other Kroot sought out strength, speed, or resilience in their prey, the kindred of Kroot sought a different kind of evolution, the refinement of their own senses, the sharpening of their minds against the psychic reverberations of a universe brimming with empiric energy. Their shaper, Kalor, was particularly adept at this macabre art. His quills, longer and more numerous than any other Kroot in his kindred, would occasionally spark with static electricity, a harmless yet unsettling display that bespoke a deeper, more profound connection to the energies they consumed. Kalor possessed an almost preternatural intuition for psychic resonance, an instinctual compass that would twitch and pull him towards the faint glow of a nascent mind or the potent storm of a fully developed psyche. His eyes, usually pools of obsidian, would sometimes catch the light with an eerie, knowing glint, as if glimpsing a sliver of the future or the echoes of the past within the minds he had consumed. Their ancestral hunting grounds on Kara were pristine, a testament to their self-imposed isolation and their refusal to dilute their genetic lineage with the crass biomass of lesser creatures. Yet even on Kara, the galaxy's grim tendrils reached out. Sporadic raids by orcs, opportunistic strikes by elder corsairs, or the chilling, silent advance of tyrannid vanguard organisms occasionally forced the kindred to adapt, to leave the mists of their homeworld and seek the unique biomass of the void. During these rare excursions, Kalor would lead his kindred with a silent, almost reverent focus, each new hunt a sacred act of dietary refinement. Their reputation, though whispered and often misunderstood, was nonetheless potent. The Toe knew them as unpredictable but immensely valuable trackers of warp-tainted foes. Certain elder factions, particularly those who dealt in shadows and secrets, regarded them with a mixture of disgust and dark fascination, occasionally employing them against psychic horrors too subtle for conventional warriors. But never, not once, in the long, blood-soaked history of the kindred of Kroot had they ever encountered an Eldar Farseer. The very thought was anathema, a notion so ludicrously dangerous that it never even entered the calculations of Kalor or his ancestors. Farseers were beings of unimaginable psychic might, their minds a lattice of prescience and ancient knowledge, protected by untold eons of evolution and the enigmatic webway itself. To hunt such a being would be akin to a lesser beast attempting to devour a star. Yet fate, or perhaps some unseen hand of the grimdark galaxy, had a different plan for the kindred of Kroot, a trajectory that would shatter their traditions, warp their bodies, and damn their very souls. Their tale was about to begin, not in the familiar mists of Kara, but on a forgotten world, bathed in the sickly glow of a dying sun, where the screams of a collapsing empire would echo in the very blood of the Kroot. The scent of raw, unbound psychic power, a beacon of irresistible allure to Kalor, was calling them, pulling them from their quiet, specialized existence into a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. The kindred of Kuul's journey to the shattered shrine world was not born of contract or allegiance, but of an irresistible, almost magnetic pull emanating from the void. For weeks, as their venerable Kroot warsphere drifted through the star-dusted arteries of the galaxy, Shaper Kalor had felt it, a psychic thrum, faint at first, then growing into a deafening roar within his very bones. It was unlike any psychic signature he had ever encountered, a symphony of power laced with an agonizing discord, a dying star of consciousness that promised an unprecedented feast. He'd ordered a deviation from their planned trajectory, much to the quiet consternation of his more traditionally minded kin. But Kalor's instincts had rarely led them astray, and the promise of new, potent biomass was a siren song few Kroot could resist. The system they entered was a graveyard. Stars, once vibrant, now hung like pallid, sickly jewels in the cosmic blackness, their light dimmed by nebulae of shattered rock and vaporized flesh. Gravitational anomalies tugged at the warsphere, the echoes of cataclysmic events scarring the very fabric of space. And at the heart of this desolate expanse lay the shrine world, an orb that had once glittered with the impossible elegance of Eldar artistry, a testament to an ancient civilization's reverence for forgotten deities. Now it was nothing more than a broken husk, weeping dust and fire into the void. Its orbital defences lay scattered, molten wrecks adrift, silent witnesses to a war that had raged beyond comprehension. As the kindred's dropships plunged through the shredded atmosphere, the scale of the devastation became horrifyingly clear. Sprawling cities of translucent crystal and gossamer bridges, once gleaming monuments to psychic grace, were now twisted skeletons of fused silica, resembling skeletal spires clawing at a blood-red sky. Vast, shimmering domes that had once housed libraries of forbidden lore or chambers of meditation lay cracked and sundered, their contents vaporized or buried beneath tons of vitrified rock. The ground itself was a patchwork of ash-choked canyons and oceans of churning toxic sludge where once verdant forests had stood. A constant, low thrum of residual psychic energy vibrated through the air, tasting of despair and death, a sensation that made Kalor's quills hum with an unholy anticipation. The battle below was a single, sprawling agony. A splinter fleet of Tyranids, a vanguard tendril from a much larger unseen horror, had descended upon the shrine world, not with the typical overwhelming force of a full hive fleet, but with a calculated, surgical precision aimed at stripping the planet of its psychic essence. Their forms were grotesque variations, adapted for psychological warfare and psychic predation. Neurothropes pulsed with sickly bio-lightning, zoanthropes shrieked waves of pure mental agony, and the ubiquitous hormigants and termagants swarmed across the landscape like a living tide, their chittering masses serving as a biological shield for the more specialized horrors. Against this overwhelming tide, a beleaguered Eldar force made its last stand. They were a tragic sight. What remained of the shrine world's guardians, augmented by a handful of aspect warriors, and what appeared to be Eldari civilians turned desperate combatants, fought with a doomed ferocity. Their elegant armour, once pristine, was now scorched and scarred. Their movements precise, but imbued with a weary desperation. Dire avengers fired in disciplined volleys, their shuriken catapults spitting death, while striking scorpions surged into the Tyranid ranks, their chainswords carving momentary paths through the chitinous horde before being swamped. Warlocks, their witchblades glowing faintly, hurled psychic bolts and conjured flickering shields, their efforts draining them even as they bought precious seconds. But they were few, and the Tyranids were endless. Kalor directed his kindred towards the epicenter of the psychic storm, a towering crystalline observatory that miraculously still stood amidst the ruins, Though it listed precariously, its upper spires shattered. The air grew thick with psychic screams here, the raw agony of dying Eldar minds mingling with the alien hunger of the Tyranid synapse creatures. Inside, the last pockets of Eldar resistance were being overwhelmed. The Kroot, masters of ambush and close-quarters combat, moved through the ruins with silent, predatory grace, their rifles barking, their blades flashing, carving their own bloody path through the Tyranid swarms. They were not fighting for the Eldar. They were fighting towards something. Kalor's internal compass screamed, pulling him deeper into the observatory's ravaged structure. Here, the Eldar fought with a fanatical desperation, protecting something or someone. Tyranid warriors, bloated and bristling with chitinous weaponry, clashed with Wraithguard, ancient constructs of psychic energy and spirit stone, their slow, deliberate strikes countering the Tyranid's speed with brutal efficacy. The ground was slick with ichor, Eldar blood, and the shredded biomass of Tyranid organisms. The air was a cacophony of screams, the rending of metal and bone, and the incessant, high-pitched psychic wails of the neurothropes. Then Kalor saw him, or rather felt him. The psychic beacon that had drawn them across the void pulsed from a chamber at the very heart of the observatory. Within, amidst a halo of shimmering psychic energy, an Eldar Farseer lay dying. He was a majestic figure, even in his final moments. His robes, once vibrant blue and gold, were torn and stained, and a grievous wound, a gaping maw of organic acid and chitinous claws, had rent his chest, exposing raw flesh and pulsing organs. His helmet, a marvel of psychically resonant materials, was cracked, revealing a face contorted in a rictus of profound suffering and grim determination. Wraithbone runes, carved into his very skin, glowed faintly, trying to hold back the encroaching tide of death. But it was a futile gesture. The Farseer's eyes, though clouded with pain, still held the distant, terrible light of prescience. He was not merely dying. He was attempting a final, desperate act, his mind a collapsing supernova of foresight and despair. He was projecting a psychic barrier, a last, fading bulwark that kept a torrent of Tyranid synaptic creatures at bay, buying precious, fleeting moments for what little remained of his kin to escape, or perhaps for a final warning to be broadcast into the webway before the shrine world was utterly consumed. But the barrier was flickering, weakening with every beat of his dying heart, and the Tyranid psychophages were pounding against it, their alien minds salivating at the feast of raw psychic energy on the other side. Kalor felt an animalistic awe, a primeval hunger, unlike anything he had ever known. The Farseer's mind was not merely powerful. It was an entire galaxy of knowledge, prescience, and suffering, ripe for consumption. Every fibre of Kalor's being, every instinct honed over generations of psychic predation, screamed at him to claim this biomass, this unparalleled prize. It was a compulsion that transcended mere hunger. It was a promise of evolution, of transformation, of a leap in Kroot development that no shaper could have ever dreamed possible. The risk was immense, the Farseer's dying psychic backlash potentially catastrophic. But the reward was unimaginable. As the last of the Eldar defenders fell, and the Tyranid psychophages broke through the Farseer's rapidly collapsing mental shield, Kalor surged forward, his blades held high, a terrifying glint in his obsidian eyes. He would not allow this sacred, powerful biomass to be defiled by the crude, unsophisticated minds of the Tyranids. This was his hunt. The chamber collapsed around them, not with the abruptness of a physical detonation, but with the insidious, fracturing cascade of psychic force. The Eldar Farseer's dying efforts had reached their zenith, a supernova of mental energy that tore at the fabric of reality within the observatory. As Kalor lunged, the last vestiges of the psychic barrier shimmered and burst, showering the chamber in mote-like fragments of pure thought. The tyrannid psychophages, a pack of writhing neurothropes and zoanthropes, recoiled momentarily, their alien minds overwhelmed by the dying Farseer's spiritual agony, but their hunger quickly reasserted itself. They surged forward, their rudimentary psychic probes lashing out, seeking to drain the Eldar's essence before it faded entirely. But Kalor was faster. With a guttural roar that was more instinct than calculated battle cry, he intercepted the leading neurothrope, his ancestral blade, honed over countless hunts, cleaving through its chitinous head with brutal efficiency. Black ichor sprayed, and the creature's psychic scream was cut short as its rudimentary brain was pulped. The other psychophages hissed, their tendrils lashing, but Kalor's loyal kin had followed him, their Kroot rifles spitting bursts of razor-sharp shrapnel, tearing apart the monstrous Xenos. They cleared a bloody path, forming a desperate perimeter around their shaper and the dying Farseer, sacrificing themselves to ensure Kalor could complete the hunt. The Farseer, his body racked by tremors, raised a trembling hand, his eyes locking with Kalor's. In that brief, agonizing moment, Kalor felt an unfathomable depth of despair and wisdom wash over him, a dying whisper of 1,000 millennia of triumphs and tragedies, of futures glimpsed and averted. There was a flicker of something else in the Farseer's gaze, too, not understanding perhaps, but a grim recognition of the alien predator standing over him, a final desperate calculation in his last moments of prescience. A single guttural cough racked the Eldar's body, and a thin stream of glittering blue-black blood, psychically charged, oozed from the corners of his mouth. Kalor did not hesitate. The Farseer's mind was a tempest of unharnessed power, and the Tyrannids were already reorganizing, their hunger an almost palpable force. The Kroot's traditional method of consumption was direct, visceral. With an almost ceremonial precision, Kalor knelt beside the dying Eldar. He did not care for the Eldar's weapons or technology. His focus was entirely on the most potent biomass. His quills, usually still, now vibrated intensely, crackling with suppressed energy. With strong, practiced hands, he manipulated the Farseer's shattered helmet, wrenching it free with a grotesque crunch of ceramic and bone. The Elder's pallid face was revealed, etched with the lines of cosmic burdens, his eyes still wide, fixed on a future only he could see, or perhaps on the Kroot before him. Then, with an unnerving detachment, Kalor began the consumption. He focused on the head, the brain, the seat of the Farseer's immense psychic power. His Kroot mouthparts, adapted over generations to efficiently process a multitude of biomass, worked with brutal efficiency. The Eldar's flesh, though alien, yielded readily to Kalor's teeth, the taste a shocking blend of metallic blood and something else entirely, a raw, unfathomable mental energy that immediately surged through his senses. It was like drinking liquid starlight, pure thought imbued with sorrow and the echo of untold futures. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Kalor's mind, usually a fortress of Kroot instinct and predatory focus, was suddenly assaulted by a torrent of alien sensations. Images flashed before his inner eye with blinding speed, distant nebulae swirling into existence and collapsing into black holes, the shimmering pathways of the webway stretching into impossible dimensions, ancient Eldar cities rising and falling through millennia, the screams of a dying empire, and most disturbingly, fleeting glimpses of potential futures, pathways that branched and converged with terrifying complexity. He saw himself, his kindred, warped and monstrous, chasing phantoms through a reality he couldn't comprehend. He saw the cold, empty gaze of the void and something beyond, something that resonated with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. The raw psychic power, unrefined and untamed, coursed through his entire being. His quills flared with blinding emerald light, pulsing erratically, and a guttural, involuntary moan escaped his throat. A sound that was not entirely Kroot, but a garbled echo of Eldar agony and prophetic insight. He convulsed violently, his body spasming as his internal physiology struggled to integrate the alien biomass, particularly the Farseer's psychic organs and brain tissue. It was not merely physical assimilation, it was a mental and spiritual integration, a forced evolution that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. His closest kin, those who had formed the defensive perimeter, felt the shockwave of it. A resonant hum, a discordant thrum, vibrated through the ground and up their own quills. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads, a wave of fractured images and raw emotion washing over them, not as intensely as Kalor, but enough to stun and disorient. They saw flickering visions of their own deaths, of ancient battles they had never fought, of star-spanning webs of light and shadow that made no sense to their Kroot minds. Their senses were assaulted by an acrid taste in the air, not of ash or blood, but of burning synapses and unraveling destiny. When Kalor finally slumped back, his body twitching uncontrollably, he was profoundly changed. His eyes, now burning with an emerald glow, stared blankly at the ruined ceiling, seeing far beyond the crumbling rockcrete and twisted metal. He breathed in ragged, gasping breaths, his Kroot biology fighting a desperate, losing battle against the alien essence now flowing through his veins. The Farseer's corpse, what little remained of its head, was a gruesome testament to the unparalleled consumption. The Tyranids, momentarily stalled by the sheer psychic discharge, pressed forward once more, their chittering hunger redoubled, but Kalor was no longer focused on them. His hand, still stained with Eldar blood and psychic residue, twitched, and his head snapped towards a direction no Kroot eye could perceive, a pathway that existed not in physical space, but in the shimmering, impossible dimensions glimpsed by his newly acquired prescience. A terrible, new hunger was born in him, something far beyond biomass. A new compulsion, cold and alien, had taken root in his very soul. The kindred of Kul, or what would become of it, had taken its first irrevocable step into a terrifying, unknown future. The immediate aftermath of the Farseer's consumption was a maelstrom of chaos, both external and internal. The Tyranids, sensing the psychic disturbance and the now unguarded biomass, surged with renewed ferocity. Kalor's loyal kin, despite their own disorienting psychic echoes, fought with a primal fury, forming a desperate defensive perimeter around their shuddering shaper. Their battlesuits and rifles spat death, carving momentary voids in the encroaching chitinous tide, but the numbers were overwhelming. Yet, Kalor remained oblivious to the physical battle, his mind ensnared in a different, far more terrifying war. His quills continued to pulse with erratic green light, occasionally flaring so brightly that his nearby kin had to shield their eyes. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the immense, uncontrolled energy now surging through him. The elder Farseer's prescience, fractured by Kroot physiology and the trauma of his death, was 1,000 screaming voices in Kalor's mind, each clamoring with visions, memories, and dire warnings. He saw the galaxy as a delicate, intricate web, threads of destiny stretching taut, some snapping, others weaving new, terrifying patterns. He glimpsed the slow, inevitable creep of entropy, the hungry maw of chaos, the relentless march of the Tyranid fleets, and the quiet despair of a dying race. These were not mere images. They were sensations, emotions, an entire history and future compressed into a single, overwhelming torrent that threatened to obliterate his Kroot identity. For hours, as his kindred fought and died to protect his inert form, Kalor lay in a semi-conscious trance, muttering in a language that was a grotesque fusion of Kroot guttural clicks and melodic Eldar inflections. He spoke of the paths of twilight, of echoes in the void, and of a great wound that bleeds stars. His kin, hardy warriors though they were deeply unnerved. They had witnessed countless acts of consumption, seen Kroot evolve and change, but never like this. Their shaper was no longer merely Kalor. He was something else, a terrifying hybrid of instinct and alien intellect. His mind, a fractured prism reflecting a myriad of impossible realities. As the last of the Tyranid forces finally broke through the kindred's valiant defense, their forms grotesque and starved, Kalor suddenly roared. It was a sound of primal rage and profound suffering, and it tore through the chamber like a physical force. A wave of raw, unchanneled psychic energy erupted from him, a violent burst of the Farseer's dying will, mixed with Kroot ferocity. The Tyranid psychophages, poised to overwhelm them, shrieked as their rudimentary minds were scorched by the psychic overload. Some exploded in geysers of ichor, others writhed on the ground, their nervous systems fried, their hunger momentarily replaced by agony. It was enough. The remaining Kroot, battered and depleted, rallied, using the momentary respite to evacuate their shaper's trembling form. Back aboard their warsphere, Kalor's condition remained unstable. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his quills flickering, his eyes darting as if watching unseen horrors. When he did speak, it was often in cryptic pronouncements. He described the whispers of ancient sorrow permeating the void, of skeletal paths stretching into darkness, and of a great hunger that is not of the flesh. These were not the coherent reports of a shaper analyzing new biomass. They were the ravings of a mind fractured by cosmic insight. The direct genetic assimilation of the Eldar's psychic organs, particularly the intricate structures responsible for prescience, had woven itself into Kalor's very DNA. But without the millennia of Eldar evolution, without the mental discipline, the webway shielding, or the spirit stone safeguards, the power was raw, untamed, and deeply corrupting. He began to experience spontaneous, uncontrolled flashes of foresight. A Kroot warrior would be about to trip, and Kalor would see it a second before it happened, a brief jolt of discomfort in his own leg. A minor malfunction in the warsphere's engines would manifest as a sudden, sickening lurch in his gut, a metallic taste in his mouth. These initial manifestations were disorienting, often manifesting as physical sensations rather than clear visions. But as days turned into weeks, they became more profound, more disturbing. He would wake from sleep screaming, clutching at his head, having witnessed a vision of the warsphere plummeting into a sun, or his entire kindred consumed by some unseen horror. His quills, always sensitive, began to itch and burn, picking up psychic static from deep space, fragments of other species' thoughts, echoes of ancient warp events. The very fabric of reality seemed thinner to him, transparent in places, revealing fleeting glimpses of impossible colours and geometries. His closest kin, those who had directly assimilated the Farseer's blood and flesh during the retreat, also began to show subtle, unsettling changes. Their quills occasionally twitched in unison with Kalor's. Their eyes sometimes glazed over, seeing things that weren't there. They reported pervasive feelings of unease, of being watched by unseen entities, and a constant, low thrumming sound that no other Kroot could hear. Their hunting efficiency, once unparalleled, suffered. They became hesitant, distracted by phantom movements, their senses overwhelmed by the psychic cacophony that now surrounded them, a discordant symphony of dread and fractured foresight. The entire kindred was plunged into a state of anxious confusion. Kalor, their infallible shaper, was compromised, consumed by an alien intelligence that spoke through him in riddles. Their traditional methods of hunting and consumption had led them not to a new strength, but to a terrifying vulnerability. Their path, once clear, was now shrouded in a psychic fog, riddled with unseen dangers. The consumption of the Farseer had unleashed something profound and terrifying, something that had irrevocably altered the kindred of Khul, binding them to a destiny they could not comprehend, chasing echoes of a great hunt that existed only in the fractured mind of their shaper. The psychic whispers had begun, and with them, the first insidious seeds of their grim new fate were sown. As the kindred of Khul's warsphere drifted further from the shattered shrine world, the psychic echoes within Kalor and his closest kin intensified, coalescing into something more coherent, yet infinitely more disturbing, a profound awareness of the webway. It began subtly, as fleeting glimpses, like static on a primitive Kroot display screen. Kalor would stare at a blank wall of the Warsphere's bridge, and for a fraction of a second, he would perceive not the familiar dull grey of Kroot metallurgy, but impossible patterns of swirling colour, a fleeting impression of vast crystalline pathways stretching into an infinite, non-Euclidean geometry. The air, usually thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and Kroot musk, would momentarily carry the faint, ethereal perfume of ozone and ancient dust, a scent that was alien and intoxicating. These sensory intrusions grew in frequency and clarity. Kalor would often find himself reaching out instinctively towards thin air, believing he felt the cold, smooth surface of a psychic conduit, only for his hand to pass through nothing. The entire kindred, especially those who had partaken most directly in the Farseer's consumption, reported disorienting sensations, sounds that weren't there, a high-pitched hum like a distant chorus of lamentation, or the whisper of a breeze through unseen corridors, would momentarily drown out the Warsphere's internal drone. Shadows would seem to stretch and contort into impossible shapes, mimicking architectural forms that no Kroot had ever seen. For Kalor, the experience was a constant, waking nightmare. His mind, already fractured by the Farseer's prescience, was now bombarded by the raw sensory input of the webway. He felt the cold, indifferent silence of its boundless chambers, the ancient, psychic resonance of its countless pathways, and the occasional, terrifying presence of things that moved within its shadowed depths, not physical beings, but echoes of thought, psychic entities, drawn to his raw, unshielded connection. He would scream in his sleep, describing tunnels of glass and shadow, and voids that sing of forgotten gods. He began to draw strange, intricate symbols on the deck plates of his command bridge, using his sharpened claws. They were not Kroot ideograms, but fluid, elegant shapes that bore a terrifying resemblance to Eldar runes, scrawled with an urgency that verged on madness. He couldn't explain what they meant, only that they felt right, that they described the way to the quiet place, the path of whispers. His closest aide, a veteran Kroot named Shamanak, watched his shaper's transformation with a growing sense of dread. Shamanak had also consumed a portion of the Farseer's flesh, and while his experience was not as profound as Kalor's, he too felt the persistent hum, the chilling sense of unseen eyes upon them. Kalor became obsessed. He would spend hours in silent contemplation, his eyes unfocused, staring into distances that defied physical reality. He was searching, constantly searching, for patterns in the chaos, for meaning in the deluge of psychic data. He began to perceive the webway not as a mere network of tunnels, but as a living, breathing entity, a labyrinthine mind with pathways of thought and corridors of memory. He sensed its immense age, its weariness, and the deep, abiding wounds inflicted upon it by the galaxy's endless wars. One day, while in a particularly deep trance, Kalor collapsed. His quills, instead of their usual green glow, flared with a violent cerulean light, and his body convulsed. Shamanak and other kin rushed to his side, fearing the worst. But as Kalor gasped back to consciousness, his eyes, wild and bloodshot, held a terrifying clarity. He pointed a trembling clawed finger at a random section of the warsphere's hull. "There," he rasped, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "The labyrinth. It calls. The way to the great hunt." To the other Kroot, the hull was just that. Cold, unyielding metal. But Kalor saw it differently. He saw a shimmering, ephemeral portal, a swirling vortex of impossible colours, barely visible, at the very edge of perception. It was not a physical gateway, but a psychic aperture, a point of entry into the labyrinthine dimension he had been glimpsing. The webway, that impossible network of psychic tunnels crafted by the Eldar, had manifested itself to him, or rather, his fractured prescience had enabled him to perceive it. He was seeing the folds of reality, the hidden pathways that crisscrossed the galaxy, like an animal suddenly gifted with X-ray vision. The implications were staggering. No Kroot had ever knowingly entered the webway, let alone perceived its existence with such clarity. It was a realm of legend, a tool of the Eldar, a place of impossible wonders and unspeakable horrors. But to Kalor, driven by the Farseer's fragmented mind and his own Kroot instinct for a new, potent hunt, it was merely a new hunting ground, a vast, unexplored territory, ripe with unknown biomass, a challenge that resonated with a primeval hunger deep within his altered soul. The constant, disorienting sensory input, the flickering visions, and the unnerving psychic connection had twisted the webway into something else in Kalor's mind. It was not a tool for travel or escape. It was the ultimate wilderness, a primordial forest of psychic energy, a perilous domain where the greatest predators might lurk, and the most exotic biomass could be found. The whispers became louder, clearer, less chaotic. They spoke of a path, a destination, a grand pursuit that awaited them within this whispering labyrinth. The kindred of Kul, once renowned for their terrestrial hunts, was now being called to a hunt beyond the stars, beyond reality itself, into the impossible depths of the webway. Their transformation was accelerating, and with it, their descent into an alien madness. The whispers, once discordant and overwhelming, began to coalesce into a singular, compelling vision within Kalor's fractured mind. It was not a precise image, not a map or a clear objective, but an overwhelming, insistent sensation, a resonant call from the deepest parts of the webway, drawing the kindred with an irresistible, terrifying pull. He called it the Shadowed Hunt, a term that encompassed both its elusive nature and its undeniable gravity. For Kalor, the webway was no longer just a source of disorienting sensory input. It was a vast, sprawling, living entity, and within its labyrinthine depths he sensed a pulse, a powerful psychic throb that was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was a source of immense power, yet laced with an ancient, profound agony, a sensation that resonated deeply with the residual suffering of the Farseer's mind now entwined with his own. This was not the raw, chaotic energy of the warp, nor the focused, deliberate power of Eldar psykers. This was something else entirely, something vast, wounded, and calling out across impossible distances. The vision of the great hunt was unified yet maddeningly vague. Kalor saw flickering glimpses of impossible architecture, not the crystalline elegance of elder craft worlds, but sprawling, organic structures woven from raw psychic energy and despair. He perceived shadowy forms, colossal and ancient, moving through a swirling void of unlight. He tasted the metallic tang of fear and the heady rush of unimaginable power. He felt an omnipresent hunger, not Kroot, not tyrannid, but something far more fundamental and primordial, a hunger that seemed to devour light and hope itself. And always, at the very heart of these visions, was that profound, aching pulse, a beacon of suffering and potential biomass that promised the ultimate evolution. He tried to communicate these visions to his kindred, particularly to Shamanak, who had become his unwilling confidant. Kalor's descriptions were a grotesque tapestry of Kroot metaphor and fragmented Eldar lexicon, utterly incomprehensible to a traditional Kroot mind. He spoke of the sorrowing heart of the labyrinth, of a song sung in forgotten light, and of the silent devourer who sleeps. He drew more complex, intricate runes, not merely on the deck plates now, but on the flesh of his own forearms, carved with his sharpened claws, which pulsed with a faint green luminescence as he worked. These carvings were agonizing, but Kalor claimed they were necessary to mark the path, to guide the hunger. The visions were not just Kalor's burden. Those kin who had consumed the Farseer's blood and flesh also felt the call, though to a lesser, more distorted degree. They experienced flashes of impossible light and shadow, heard the phantom whispers, and felt a gnawing, inexplicable craving deep within their own stomachs. It was a hunger for something beyond meat, beyond bone, a hunger for raw psychic essence, for the very fabric of fragmented thought. This shared, albeit fragmented experience created a terrifying, unifying psychosis within the core of the kindred. They were all touched by the Farseer's dying curse, bound to Kalor's mad quest. The Great Hunt, as Kalor now understood it, was not a hunt for physical prey. It was a hunt for a concept, an entity of pure psychic energy, a power that could elevate the kindred beyond any Kroot's wildest dreams or utterly consume them. The Farseer's final, desperate attempt to send a warning, to mark a dangerous anomaly within the webway, had been tragically inverted by Kalor's consumption. His dying prescience, meant to avert disaster, had instead become a twisted lure, an irresistible call to the very danger it sought to highlight. Kalor's obsession became the kindred's sole purpose. He neglected traditional hunting, ignored mercenary contracts, and ceased to communicate with any Kroot outside his immediate circle. His once sharp, predatory focus had narrowed, becoming singularly fixated on this shadowed hunt. He commanded his kindred to begin preparations, not for a conventional war or a planetary expedition, but for something entirely unknown. They began to hoard strange, psychically resonant crystals scavenged from the Eldar shrine world, believing they would chart the internal ocean. They sharpened their blades with esoteric rituals, chanting Kroot war hymns interspersed with Eldar phrases that Kalor had subconsciously assimilated. The kindred's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Some Kroot would stare blankly at walls, muttering about the path of tears. Others would collapse into fits of shivering, claiming to feel the cold gaze of the sleeping watcher. Their usual boisterous camaraderie was replaced by a grim, silent determination, broken only by Kalor's cryptic pronouncements. Their movements became subtly different, more fluid, almost preternaturally silent, as if they were already moving through the ethereal planes of the webway. The Great Hunt was all that mattered. The fragmented prescience within Kalor was no longer just showing him snippets of the future. It was directing him, guiding him, pulling him towards this unknown, unseen goal. It was a terrifying evolution, a forced adaptation, a path to power and madness that only the kindred of Kul could perceive, and one that they were irrevocably bound to follow, driven by the echoes of a dying god and the insatiable hunger of a transformed shaper. The shadowed hunt had begun, and the kindred of Kul was its unwitting and unwilling instrument. The kindred of Kul's growing obsession with the shadowed hunt was not lost on others. Their erratic behaviour, their withdrawal from traditional Kroot alliances, and Kalor's increasingly cryptic pronouncements began to cause deep rifts, first within their own extended kindred, then with their few fleeting allies in the Toe Empire. The Toe, ever pragmatic, found Kalor's newfound fixation on psychic labyrinths and sorrowing hearts to be deeply disturbing, unsuited for the disciplined conduct of mercenary warfare. Requests for their services were met with dismissive silence or nonsensical replies about following the unseen currents. On their homeworld of Kara, the news of Kalor's strange transformation was met with a mixture of fear and condemnation. Other kindreds, traditionally wary of Kul's esoteric diet, now saw their fears confirmed. They sent emissaries, venerable shapers of other lineages, to ascertain Kalor's state. These delegations returned disturbed, speaking of Kalor's eyes glowing with an alien light, of his quills crackling with uncontrolled psychic energy, and of his kindred's unsettling, silent intensity. They reported Kalor's insistence on the great cleansing, the consumption of the silent scream, and his relentless preparation for a hunt that defied all Kroot understanding. The elders of Kara concluded that Kalor and his kindred had become tainted. The consumption of such potent alien biomass without the careful, disciplined assimilation usually overseen by a council of shapers had evidently warped their essence. They were deemed to be dangerously unstable, a threat to the genetic purity and traditional ways of the Kroot. A decree was issued. The kindred of Kul was to be exiled, their warsphere forbidden from returning to Kara, their lineage severed from the ancestral tree. If they were to pursue this mad hunt, they would do so alone. This pronouncement, delivered by a solemn, grey-quilled shaper elder via encrypted Vox channel, ripped through the kindred of Kul like a physical wound. For generations, their identity had been tied to Kara, to the ancestral hunting grounds, to the collective memory of their people. To be cast out was a fate worse than death, a spiritual amputation. Many of the kindred who had not directly consumed the Farseer's biomass, and thus were less affected by the psychic fallout, pleaded with Kalor to reconsider, to seek a cure, to return to the traditional path. They saw the madness in his eyes, the unsettling glow in his quills, and they feared for their souls. But Kalor was beyond reasoning. The call of the shadowed hunt was too strong, the fragmented prescience too insistent. He saw their pleas not as loyalty, but as weakness, as a failure to embrace the evolutionary leap that lay before them. His mind, now a crucible of Kroot instinct and Eldar foresight, perceived only the path to the sorrowing heart, to the ultimate biomass. He responded with a chilling, dispassionate resolve. "They do not see," he rasped, his voice a strange blend of guttural Kroot and melodic, almost mournful elder inflections. "They do not hear the song of the labyrinth. Their paths are of flesh and bone. Ours is of shadow and thought. We must follow our hunger, for it is the galaxy's true call." A deep schism tore through the kindred. Families were broken, loyalties shattered. Some of the Kroot, unable to reconcile their shaper's madness with their sacred traditions, chose to abandon the kindred of Kul, taking their small personal craft and scattering into the void, hoping to find a new place, a new kindred, or perhaps a merciful death. They looked back at the retreating warsphere with a mixture of sorrow and horror, knowing they were witnessing the damnation of a proud lineage. Yet, a substantial core remained. These were the Kroot who had been most directly affected by the Farseer's essence, those who felt the hum, heard the whispers, and glimpsed the impossible architectures of the webway. They were irrevocably bound to Kalor, not just by loyalty, but by the psychic tendrils that now permeated their very being. They were the afflicted, the chosen, the damned. They saw Kalor not as mad, but as elevated, transcended. His visions were their visions, his hunger their hunger, even if they didn't fully comprehend it. They were a kindred, forged in alien fire, bound for an unknown destiny. With the dissenters gone, the kindred of Kool, now a leaner, more fanatical entity, turned its back on the known galaxy. Kalor, no longer restrained by the concerns of his peers or the dictates of tradition, pushed them relentlessly. He directed the warsphere towards coordinates that existed only in his mind, points of confluence within the webway's hidden currents. The journey was harrowing, plunging through uncharted regions of the void, skirting demon worlds and navigating treacherous stellar phenomena, guided by Kalor's fractured prescience and the ceaseless pull of the shadowed hunt. Their isolation was complete, no longer bound by Kroot traditions, no longer beholden to any outside force. The kindred of Kool was adrift, a self-contained entity of evolving madness and escalating hunger. They were now truly alone, embarking on a quest perceived only by their altered minds, driven by a vision that promised either ultimate power or utter annihilation. The departure was not merely a physical act. It was a final, irreversible severing from their past, a commitment to a new, terrifying existence in the grimdark expanse. Their journey into the unknown had truly begun. The journey into the webway was not a simple act of charting a course and engaging drives. It was a horrifying descent into a realm beyond mortal comprehension, a dimension woven from the raw stuff of psychic energy and ancient Eldar artistry. Kalor, guided by the ceaseless, insistent whispers of his fragmented prescience, piloted their venerable Kroot warsphere not through physical space, but through a series of increasingly elaborate psychic apertures that appeared only to his altered sight. These were not the stable, gleaming portals that Eldar might utilize, but tearing wounds in reality, shimmering rifts that snapped shut almost as soon as they passed through. The sensation of transition was visceral and terrifying. Each passage was a wrenching experience, a momentary dissolution of form and thought. The very atoms of the warsphere screamed in protest, vibrating uncontrollably as they were stretched and compressed across impossible vectors. Within the ship, Kroot warriors, even those less affected by the Farseer's essence, writhed in agony, their minds assaulted by a cacophony of disembodied whispers, phantom pains, and the chilling sensation of being watched by unseen entities from the warp, ever hungry and ever present at the frayed edges of the webway. Some vomited, their Kroot biology struggling to contain the sheer psychic trauma. Others collapsed into catatonia, their eyes wide with visions of cosmic horror. Once inside the webway proper, the environment defied all Kroot understanding of reality. It was not the vacuum of space, nor the solid ground of a planet. Instead, they found themselves in vast, echoing chambers of impossibly smooth, obsidian-like material, stretching into distances that defied optical measurement. Pathways of shimmering, ethereal light snaked through the darkness, sometimes forming dizzying spirals, other times vanishing into glowing mists. Gravity was a suggestion, often localized and arbitrary, causing objects and Kroot alike to drift aimlessly until a localized field reasserted itself. The air, if it could be called that, was thin and tasted of ozone and ancient dust, a scent that now felt strangely familiar to Kalor. The greatest challenge was the disorientation. Without the fixed points of stars, without the familiar pull of planetary gravity, without even the comforting hum of conventional engines, The Kroot's primal instincts for direction and navigation were useless. Only Kalor, driven by the Farseer's fragmented prescience, seemed to possess any sense of purpose. He navigated the warsphere through pathways that appeared and disappeared, through chambers where the very concept of up and down shifted arbitrarily, all while muttering his cryptic pronouncements about the threads of memory and the currents of sorrow. The webway was far from empty. It was a place of ancient, often hostile, energies. Minor warp entities, drawn to the raw, unrefined psychic energy emanating from the kindred, would occasionally manifest. They were fleeting, insubstantial things, shadow forms that writhed at the periphery of vision, whispers that tugged at sanity, momentary cold spots that drained the warmth from their bodies. Kalor's nascent prescience, crude as it was, sometimes gave them a moment's warning, allowing the Kroot to unleash a volley of rifle fire at empty air, sometimes with startling effect, vaporizing the ethereal foes. But more often, these encounters were subtle, insidious, wearing down the kindred's morale and resolve. Beyond the ethereal denizens, the webway itself seemed to recoil from their alien presence. Ancient Eldar defense mechanisms, designed for much more sophisticated intrusions, would occasionally activate. Walls would shimmer and turn hostile, manifesting psychic barriers that threatened to crush the warsphere, or unleashing bursts of focused energy that screamed through the void. Kalor, in a flash of prescient insight, would often command impossible evasive maneuvers, weaving the lumbering warsphere through corridors barely wide enough, dodging phantom psychic projectiles that only he could perceive, pushing the ship's ancient systems to their breaking point. The constant psychic bombardment, the oppressive strangeness of the environment, and the unyielding pressure of Kalor's single-minded pursuit began to take a severe toll on the kindred. Their once robust Kroot physiology was under immense strain. Many suffered from chronic headaches, nosebleeds, and a perpetual state of nervous agitation. Their Kroot carnivores, normally boisterous and eager for battle, became withdrawn, their eyes haunted, their quills dull. Even Shamanak, Kalor's closest aide, found himself succumbing to bouts of profound despair, glimpsing his own death in a dozen horrific ways within the labyrinth. Yet they pressed on. Kalor's connection to the shadowed hunt deepened with every passing day spent within the webway. He perceived it now not just as a location, but as a destination of profound significance, a nexus of suffering and power that called to the very essence of the Farseer's dying mind within him. He was no longer leading them. He was being led, a puppet of an ancient alien destiny, dragging his entire kindred with him into the depths of a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The webway, the Eldar's sacred highway, had become the Kroot's road to perdition, a twisting, psychic gauntlet from which they could never truly return. Their passage through the webway was not a linear journey, but a nightmarish peregrination through a realm of shattered causality and spectral echoes. Kalor, the conduit for the fractured prescience, became an oracle of madness, guiding the warsphere along pathways that defied logic and conventional navigation. He spoke in riddles and guttural pronouncements, pointing to shimmering voids that would open into new, impossible chambers, or commanding the ship to accelerate through phantom walls that other Kroot only perceived as solid. This was the path of whispers, a chaotic, unpredictable route dictated by the Farseer's dying memories and Kalor's insatiable alien hunger. The internal landscape of the webway was a constant assault on their Kroot senses. They passed through vast chambers of perfect, silent blackness, broken only by the shimmering, self-illuminated pathways, where the sense of scale was utterly lost. They navigated through regions where gravity inverted itself, sending Kroot warriors sprawling against ceilings that became floors. They witnessed fleeting visions of other webway travelers, sleek, ghost-like Eldar craft shimmering past on distant conduits, their inhabitants blissfully unaware of the Kroot's crude, blundering passage through their sacred space. Kalor occasionally caught glimpses of these craft, not as physical objects, but as threads of thought, ripples in the psychic currents, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of the Farseer's knowledge would surface, hinting at the true nature of their pursuers. The most disturbing aspect of their journey was the constant, insidious corruption of their Kroot physiology. The webway, steeped in psychic energy and the echoes of Eldar thought, was slowly, imperceptibly altering them. The Kroot's natural inclination to assimilate the qualities of their consumed prey began to work in a grotesque, unintended fashion. Without fresh biomass, without the varied diet crucial to their species' health, the kindred was forced to metabolize their own diminishing stores, compounded by the alien psychic energies they were immersed in. Kalor, as the primary conduit, was the most profoundly affected. His quills, once a vibrant green, began to change color, developing an iridescent, almost pearlescent sheen, shimmering with faint, uncontrolled psychic energy. His skin, usually a mottled grey-green, developed patches of translucent, crystalline growths, like warped wraithbone. His eyes, already glowing with emerald light, occasionally pulsed with the violet hue of raw psychic power. His physical form, once lean and powerful, grew gaunt, his movements becoming jerky and unnatural, as if his body struggled to obey a mind that was now half alien. His kindred followed suit, albeit more slowly. Those who had directly consumed the Farseer's flesh began to experience minor physical mutations. Their quills would twitch and spark. Their skin would occasionally ripple, manifesting patterns that mirrored the Eldar runes Kalor carved. Their sense of taste, usually so crucial to Kroot survival, began to atrophy, replaced by a phantom hunger for psychic sustenance. They found themselves drawn to the faint psychic resonance of the webway itself, almost unconsciously absorbing residual energies, a horrifying substitution for proper biomass. This consumption of non-physical sustenance, the very fabric of the webway's psychic essence, had a profound and disturbing effect on their genetic code. Their Kroot shapers, even Kalor himself, normally meticulously guiding the evolutionary path of their kindred through selective consumption, found themselves powerless. The assimilation was happening spontaneously, uncontrollably, dictated by the alien energies of their environment and the Eldar essence within them. The result was a grotesque parody of Kroot evolution. Instead of becoming stronger, faster, more resilient, they were becoming ethereal, translucent, their bodies subtly adapting to a psychic plane of existence. Their blood, once thick and crimson, grew thinner, taking on a faintly shimmering, almost luminescent quality. They had several accidental brushes with ancient Eldar defenses, automated systems designed to repel warp intrusions or lesser xenos. These were not the crude traps of primitive races, but intricate psychic wards, energy fields that resonated with pure thought, or construct spirits that lashed out with searing bolts of concentrated willpower. Kalor's fractured prescience offered fleeting warnings, allowing the warsphere to swerve or deploy emergency energy shields, often by mere milliseconds. These encounters, while terrifying, served to further Kalor's conviction that the webway was a new, perilous hunting ground, full of powerful, if abstract, prey. But the most insidious corruption was mental. The Kroot's natural, pragmatic minds, designed for survival and efficient consumption, were overwhelmed by the sheer, unbridled psychic input of the webway. They became prone to fits of melancholic introspection, speaking of lost futures and forgotten glories in a manner entirely alien to their species. Their dreams were a kaleidoscope of Eldar memories, ancient sorrows, and fleeting glimpses of the infinite. They were becoming less Kroot and more something else, a terrifying hybrid of instinct and psychic echo, pulled deeper and deeper into the path of whispers, towards the heart of the shadowed hunt. They were no longer merely travelling through the webway, they were becoming a part of it. The increasingly erratic trajectory of the Kroot warsphere, guided by Kalor's fractured prescience, had not gone entirely unnoticed within the labyrinthine passages of the webway. While the Eldar of the craftworlds largely ignored such crude, blundering incursions, believing them to be minor warp anomalies or the lost vessels of lesser races, there were other denizens, darker and more predatory, whose senses were attuned to the slightest psychic disturbance. It began with subtle probes, fleeting, icy tendrils of thought brushing against the Kroot's minds, testing their defenses, assessing their nature. Kalor felt them first, manifesting as cold pinpricks behind his eyes, or a sudden, acrid taste on his tongue. He would snarl, his quills flaring, sensing an unseen predator tracking their movements. His fragmented prescience showed him glimpses of shimmering forms, of barbed implements, and a profound, chilling cruelty that made his Kroot instincts recoil, even as his Eldar-infused mind recognized the malevolence. These were the Drukhari, the Dark Kin, masters of torture and psychic predation, dwellers in the darker corners of the webway. A splinter cult of homunculi, known as the Coven of the Bleeding Veil, had been experimenting with particularly esoteric forms of psychic manipulation, attempting to graft warp entities into mortal flesh. They had established hidden laboratories in derelict webway strongholds, far from the watchful eyes of their craftworld cousins or the more mainstream cabals. The unique psychic signature emanating from the Kroot warsphere, a bizarre fusion of unrefined Eldar prescience, crude Kroot instinct, and the raw psychic energy of the webway, was an irresistible lure to their depraved curiosities. Archon Malkarian, a decadent and ancient Drukhari lord who patronized the Coven, sensed the Kroot's approach. He was a being of unimaginable age, his body a masterpiece of homunculi surgical art, perpetually resculpted and enhanced. His mind, honed by centuries of psychic torment and dark pleasure, recognized the chaotic yet potent energy signature as something utterly unique. This was no mere stray craft-welder, nor a blundering human psyker. This was an abomination, a living paradox, a lesser Xenos species that had somehow assimilated the very essence of Eldari foresight. Such a creature, Malkarian mused with a gleeful shiver, would make for an exquisite study. Its consumption of a Farseer's mind was a violation of the highest order, an insult to the Eldar, yet it had resulted in a fascinating mutation. The first direct encounter was swift and brutal. As the warsphere navigated a particularly twisting nexus of webway tunnels, a small fleet of Venom transports, their hulls shimmering with cloaking fields, erupted from a hidden alcove. They were piloted by Wychers of the Cult of the Severed Spine, known for their savage close combat and utter disregard for their own lives. Razor flails and splinters blazed, raking across the warsphere's shields, trying to punch through its aging armor. The Kroot, though disoriented by the webway, reacted with the primal ferocity of their species. Kalor, his quills flaring, screamed a series of guttural commands, anticipating the Drukhari's flanking maneuvers a split second before they occurred. Kroot carnivores, their own quills crackling with nascent psychic energy, directed their Kroot rifles with uncanny accuracy, their raw instincts augmented by fragmented foresight. The close-quarters battle was a chaotic ballet of alien violence. Kroot blades met Wyche razor flails, splinter rounds peppered Kroot flesh, and Kroot blood splattered across the warsphere's darkened corridors. The Drukhari, accustomed to terrorizing lesser species, were met with an unexpected ferocity and an unnerving, almost prescient defense. They expected fear. They encountered a primal, evolved hunger. They expected disarray. They found a kindred driven by an incomprehensible, unifying madness. Many witches were overwhelmed, their bodies torn apart by frenzied Kroot, who seemed to anticipate their every move. But the Drukhari were not easily deterred. They were merely testing, observing. Archon Malkarian, watching from the bridge of his custom-built raider, a skeletal vessel adorned with the flayed skins of vanquished foes, savoured the unfolding spectacle. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible flickers in the Kroot shaper's mind, the raw psychic energy that betrayed the source of their unnatural prescience. The Kroot were an anomaly, a terrifying perversion, yet one with immense potential for his coven's dark arts. To dissect such a creature, to unravel the secret of its warped evolution, to perhaps even replicate it. The thought sent a shiver of exquisite delight down his spine. He ordered a strategic retreat for his initial forces. This was not a hunt for mere sport. This was a capture operation. The Kroot were too valuable to be simply exterminated. Malkarian understood, with the detached cruelty of his kind, that the Kroot shaper, Kalor, was the key. His fragmented mind, a living conduit to the webway and a repository of stolen Eldar foresight, was a prize beyond measure. The kindred of Kul, though victorious in the skirmish, understood little of what had just occurred. Kalor merely grunted about the sharp-boned ones who seek to steal our thoughts, and pushed the warsphere deeper into the webway, following the inexorable call of the shadowed hunt. They did not know that they had attracted the attention of a far more dangerous predator, one that did not seek their biomass, but their very essence, their transformed souls. The Scions of Anguish, as Malkarian's coven was known, would become their relentless, shadowy antagonists, pursuing them through the endless, echoing void of the webway, a constant, chilling reminder that even in madness, there were always those darker still. The constant, unshielded exposure to the raw psychic energies of the webway, coupled with the unstable, fragmented prescience gleaned from the Farseer, began to inexorably unravel Kalor's mind. His consciousness, once a pragmatic fusion of Kroot instinct and shaper intellect, became a battleground for alien thought patterns, warring against his primal self. He was a living paradox, a beast driven by cosmic foresight, a hunter whose prey existed on an entirely different plane of reality. The physical manifestations of his internal strife grew grotesque. His quills, perpetually flaring with emerald and violet light, now emitted a constant low crackle like static electricity before a storm. Patches of his skin, particularly around his scalp and forearms, took on an almost translucent quality, revealing the veins and capillaries beneath, pulsing with unnatural light. His eyes, perpetually wide, held a terrifying multi-layered gaze. One moment, the cold predatory stare of a Kroot, the next, the distant, sorrowful wisdom of a dying Eldar. He spoke in tongues, his voice shifting between guttural Kroot growls and melodic, despairing Eldar phrases, often in the same sentence, as if two beings were fighting for control of his vocal cords. Sleep offered no respite. His dreams were a hallucinatory torrent of Eldar memories, futures glimpsed and averted, the screams of a collapsing empire, and the ceaseless, insistent pull of the shadowed hunt. He would awaken screaming, clawing at his head, convinced he was reliving the Farseer's death, or witnessing the birth of a new, horrifying star. Paranoia became his constant companion. He saw betrayal in every shadow, threats in every unexpected sound, convinced that unseen entities within the webway, or the relentlessly pursuing Drukhari, were attempting to steal his newfound insights. His leadership, once clear and decisive, became erratic and tyrannical. He demanded absolute obedience, punishing even minor deviations with a cold, almost ritualistic cruelty. His kindred, already suffering from the psychological toll of the webway, found themselves caught between the terror of their shaper's escalating madness and the alien dread of their surroundings. They followed him, not out of unthinking loyalty, but out of a desperate, shared sense of being irrevocably bound to his fate, their own minds increasingly touched by the psychic echoes that permeated their very being. The kindred itself began to degenerate, their forms, already subtly altered by the consumption of non-physical webway energies, grew more pronounced in their grotesque evolution. Their skin became paler, almost ethereal, some developing faint, shimmering patterns reminiscent of wraithbone. Their quills, like claws, crackled with psychic energy, sometimes discharging in uncontrolled bursts. Their natural healing factor, so crucial to Kroot's survival, began to wane, replaced by a strange, almost spiritual resilience that allowed them to endure injuries that would kill other Kroot, but did not allow them to fully recover. Wounds would mend, but scars would remain, faintly glowing with psychic light. Their diet, too, had become irrevocably altered. They still craved biomass, but the craving was now secondary to an insatiable, growing hunger for psychic resonance. They would unconsciously absorb residual psychic energy from the webway, a fleeting, unsatisfying sensation that temporarily sated the gnawing void within them. When they encountered the occasional unfortunate warp entity, they would fall upon it with a ravenous, horrifying ferocity, not merely for its physical form, but for its raw psychic essence, consuming its very spirit in a desperate attempt to fill the void. This alien form of consumption, however, only accelerated their own degeneration, making them more ethereal, more attuned to the webway, and less Kroot. Kalor's constant pronouncements about the shadowed hunt became more elaborate, more terrifying. He described it as a wailing star, a heart of shattered light, an entity of immense power that fed on despair and sorrow. His visions of it were no longer fleeting glimpses, but prolonged, immersive experiences, where he felt the entity's ancient, profound agony, its gnawing hunger, and its terrible, seductive promise of ultimate insight. He saw himself and his kindred as the destined instruments of its consumption, the only beings capable of truly assimilating its unique, powerful essence. The pursuit by Archon Malkarian and the Coven of the Bleeding Veil became a constant, palpable pressure. Kalor's fractured prescience, despite his deteriorating mental state, often gave them just enough warning to evade capture, to twist away from a Drukhari ambush, or to discover a hidden passage just before a raiding party could board. These near misses, however, only amplified Kalor's paranoia and the kindred's terror. They were like cornered animals, driven deeper into the labyrinth, their minds and bodies slowly warping, their shaper spiraling into a cosmic madness that promised no end but the shadowed hunt. The descent was complete. The kindred of Khul was no longer merely traversing the webway, they were being consumed by it, transformed into its spectral denizens. The fragmented prescience, once a bewildering torrent, now began to focus Kalor's attention with a chilling, singular clarity. The great hunt finally revealed itself in more terrifying detail. It was not a physical beast, nor a conventional Xenos threat. It was a psychic nexus, a wounded fragment of a lost divinity, or perhaps a malevolent psychic entity trapped deep within the desolate, unexplored recesses of the webway. It radiated both immense raw power and profound, unbearable agony, a siren song to Kalor's unique hybrid hunger. His visions became less abstract, though no less disturbing. He saw not solid forms, but colossal, shimmering currents of psychic energy, coalescing into a spectral heart that pulsed with sorrow and power.
He saw it bathed in a perpetual twilight, guarded by phantoms of ancient despair, surrounded by impossible, decaying elder architecture that seemed to writhe with its own pain. The source of its wound was unclear, perhaps inflicted during the fall of the Eldar, or by some ancient forgotten conflict that ripped a shard from a nascent deity. Whatever its origin, it was a being of pure psychic essence, a raw, exposed nerve of the galaxy, bleeding despair into the webway. Kalor named it the Sorrowing Heart, a grotesque fusion of the elder Farseer's memories of the fall and his own Kroot understanding of a prime hunting prize. His entire being now resonated with its call, an irresistible urge to consume its power, to assimilate its ancient suffering and transcend the limitations of his physical form. He believed, with the unwavering conviction of true madness, that by devouring the Sorrowing Heart, the kindred of Kul would achieve the ultimate evolution, becoming beings of pure prescience and unfathomable power. The journey towards the Sorrowing Heart was fraught with escalating perils. The webway grew darker, its pathways more treacherous, its silence more profound. They passed through regions where the very air tasted of despair, where the echoes of ancient Eldar lamentations seemed to cling to the hull of the warsphere. The environment itself seemed to become hostile, warping the senses and draining the will. Kroot warriors began to suffer from a unique form of psychic decay. Their bodies, already fragile from the unnatural diet, would occasionally flicker, becoming translucent, as if their connection to the physical realm was weakening. They spoke in hushed, mournful tones, their minds saturated with the despair of the Sorrowing Heart, even from a distance. The Coven of the Bleeding Veil, led by the relentless Archon Malkarian, intensified their pursuit. The Drukhari were closing in, their sleek, shadowy vessels pressing harder, their raiding parties more numerous and vicious. Kalor's prescience, though still fractured, became acutely focused on evading them, anticipating their ambushes with a chilling accuracy that bordered on the miraculous. He would steer the warsphere through collapsing webway sections, using the destruction as a shield, or through regions infested with warp entities, letting the monstrous denizens deal with his pursuers. He no longer cared for tactical elegance, only desperate survival, driven by the absolute necessity of reaching the Sorrowing Heart. The kindred of Kul, a mere shadow of their former selves, fought with the ferocity of cornered beasts. Their forms were now truly monstrous, their skin pale and shimmering, their quills crackling with raw psychic power. They wielded their Kroot rifles and blades with unnatural precision, their eyes burning with a mixture of madness and alien foresight. They were no longer fighting for profit or for Kroot pride. They were fighting for Kalor's vision, for the promise of the shadowed hunt, for the ultimate, terrifying evolution that awaited them. Their diet, almost entirely devoid of physical biomass, now consisted of whatever stray psychic energies they could absorb from the webway, or the tortured thoughts of the Drukhari they occasionally managed to overwhelm. These psychic feasts, though fleeting, provided momentary surges of power, glimpses of the vastness that lay before them, reinforcing Kalor's insane conviction. Each kill of a Drukhari was not merely a victory, it was a desperate act of psychic sustenance, a consumption of fear and anguish that further warped their bodies and minds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of torment, Kalor brought the warsphere to a halt. Before them lay a colossal cathedral-like chamber, vast beyond comprehension, its walls shimmering with an ethereal, violet light. And at its very heart, pulsating with an unbearable sorrow, was the Sorrowing Heart itself. It was a nebulous entity, a colossal, swirling vortex of pure psychic energy, twisting and writhing like a dying star. It emanated waves of profound despair and cosmic anguish, yet simultaneously radiated an immense, unholy power. It was the ultimate prey, a god shard of suffering, a boundless reservoir of psychic essence. Kalor stood on the bridge, his body trembling, his quills flaring with an inner fire that threatened to consume him. His eyes, burning with a multi-hued light, were fixed on the sorrowing heart. He knew, with an absolute, terrifying certainty, that this was the end of their journey, the culmination of the shadowed hunt. They had found their ultimate biomass. But its consumption would be no mere act of eating flesh and bone. This would be a battle of wills, a psychic devouring, a desperate and horrifying act of assimilation that would either grant them unimaginable power or tear their very souls to oblivion. The dark kin were closing in, but Kalor no longer cared. All that mattered was the sorrowing heart, and the terrible, beautiful promise of its final consumption. The colossal chamber, vast and ancient, thrummed with the unbearable sorrow of the entity at its heart. The sorrowing heart pulsed with a sickly violet light, casting long, writhing shadows that seemed to coil with despair. Kalor stood on the bridge of the battered war sphere, his skeletal frame rigid, his eyes locked on the shimmering psychic nexus. His quills, now a chaotic kaleidoscope of emerald, violet, and iridescent grey, crackled with raw, unstable energy. The fragmented prescience within him roared, a crescendo of farseer anguish and Kroot hunger, urging him forward to the ultimate consumption. Behind him, the remaining kindred of Kul, a mere fraction of their former strength, moved with an eerie, silent determination. Their forms were ghost-like, translucent in places, their movements unnaturally fluid. Their Kroot rifles, now imbued with a faint, psychic resonance, felt cold and alien in their hands. They were beyond fear, beyond hope, driven only by the unifying madness of their shaper's vision and the shared psychic addiction to the webway's strange energies. The Drukhari, led by Archon Malkarian, were a fleeting concern, a minor irritation in the face of this cosmic culmination. Their ships were just entering the vast chamber, their weapons beginning to cycle, but Kalor paid them no heed. "The time has come," Kalor rasped, his voice a horrifying chorus of Eldar sorrow and Kroot guttural clicks. "The great hunt is upon us. We shall consume the sorrow and become all that we are meant to be." He descended from the bridge, a skeletal spectre of his former self, followed by his loyal kin. They emerged from the warsphere not onto solid ground, but onto a vast, ethereal platform that seemed to be woven from solidified psychic energy. The air was thick with the entity's despair, a palpable weight that threatened to crush their minds. As they approached the sorrowing heart, the entity seemed to stir, its pulsing light intensifying, its waves of psychic anguish lashing out like physical blows. Visions flooded their minds. Not Kalor's complex prescience, but raw, unfiltered images of Eldar suffering. The fall, the death of billions, the birth of Slanesh, the endless, gnawing guilt of a dying race. Many Kroot fell to their knees, clutching their heads, their minds unable to bear the weight of such ancient, profound grief. Kalor, however, pressed on, his resolve unshaken. "It calls to us!" he shrieked, his voice filled with a terrible exhilaration. "Its pain is our nourishment." He was not going to fight the sorrowing heart in the traditional sense. He was going to devour it. This was not a physical act of consumption, but a psychic one, a desperate, terrifying attempt to assimilate a being of pure thought and emotion. With a primal roar, Kalor lunged forward, not with his ancestral blade, but with his very mind. He projected his consciousness, a raw, unshielded torrent of Kroot hunger and fractured Eldar prescience, towards the pulsing entity. The impact was cataclysmic. A silent scream ripped through the chamber, a psychic shriek that vibrated through the very fabric of the webway. The sorrowing heart pulsed violently, lashing out with tendrils of pure psychic agony, attempting to repel the intrusive consciousness. Kalor was engulfed, his physical form writhing on the ethereal platform, his quills erupting in a dazzling, blinding display of multi-hued light. His Kroot mind wrestled with the ancient cosmic despair of the sorrowing heart, trying to break it down, to integrate its essence. His kindred, empowered by their own warped evolution, joined him. They formed a circle around Kalor, their quills flaring, their minds attempting to connect to their shaper's struggle. They began to chant, a low, guttural Kroot rhythm infused with Eldar lamentations, a grotesque prayer of psychic consumption. Their bodies became conduits, drawing in the overflowing psychic energy, attempting to shunt it into Kalor, reinforcing his assault. Their own forms flickered violently, some dissolving partially into shimmering motes of light, their physical integrity unable to withstand the strain. At that moment, the Drukhari struck. Archon Malkarian, having observed the bizarre ritual with perverse fascination, ordered his forces to engage. Vekt's splinter fleet, their raider and ravager gunships spewing splinter rounds and dark lances, descended upon the Kroot. He wanted Kalor captured, but if the ritual was to be interrupted, a moment of weakness might yield the prize he truly sought. The raw psychic energy of the sorrowing heart, now unleashed and unprotected. The battle that erupted was chaos incarnate. The few remaining Kroot warriors, their minds locked in psychic communion with Kalor, fought back against the Drukhari with a chilling, almost prescient fury. They dodged dark lances with impossible reflexes, tore through witches with glowing claws, their Kroot rifles spitting psychic bolts that seared flesh and shattered spirit stones. Their numbers were few, but their desperation and the alien power flowing through them made them terrifying opponents. Yet the Drukhari were relentless, their cruelty a cold, calculated force. They were cutting through the Kroot, their focus primarily on suppressing the psychic ritual and capturing Kalor. But Kalor was beyond capture, beyond even physical pain. He was locked in a titanic struggle with the sorrowing heart. The entity was fighting back, flooding his mind with images of the old ones, of ancient civilizations rising and falling, of the terrible cost of psychic power. It tried to drown him in its grief, to break his Kroot will. But Kalor's primal hunger, honed over millennia, proved stronger. He was not trying to understand the sorrowing heart, he was trying to devour it. With a final, shattering mental thrust, Kalor's consciousness plunged into the very core of the sorrowing heart. The entity flared, convulsed, and then, with a soundless cosmic shriek that echoed only in the minds of those present, it began to collapse inward. Its immense power, its ancient agony, its fractured divinity, all began to flow into Kalor. The act of consumption was horrifying, an unmaking and remaking on a scale no Kroot could have ever conceived. Kalor's physical body distended, twisted, and then exploded in a burst of pure, raw psychic energy, incinerating the surrounding Kroot who had linked their minds to his. The sorrowing heart was gone, consumed. But Kalor was also gone. Where he had stood, a vortex of shimmering, multi-hued light now swirled, contained by the desperate psychic wards of the remaining, dying kindred. The climax was reached, a horrifying, Pyrrhic victory. The great hunt was over, and the Kroot had claimed their prize, but at the cost of their shaper, their kindred, and perhaps their very souls. The chamber was filled with the fading echoes of a cosmic scream and the chilling silence of a new, terrifying presence. The aftermath was a tableau of psychic devastation and physical carnage. Where the sorrowing heart had pulsed with its agonizing violet light, now only an echoing void remained, a silence so profound it seemed to suck the very light from the colossal chamber. The swirling vortex of multi-hued energy that was once Kalor pulsed erratically, a terrifying monument to the consumed entity. suspended above the ethereal platform. Around it, the remnants of the kindred of Kul lay scattered. Those who had linked directly with Kalor in his final desperate act of consumption had been utterly obliterated, their forms atomized by the uncontrolled psychic discharge. Their last, desperate sacrifice had channeled the overwhelming energies into their shaper, ensuring the consumption was complete, but at the cost of their own existence. What remained were the Kroot who had been further back, those whose psychic connection was less direct, or who had been caught in the crossfire of the Drukhari assault. These survivors were irrevocably changed, their physical forms twisted and warped beyond recognition. Their skin was no longer merely pale. It was translucent, almost ghostly, revealing the faint luminous network of veins beneath. Their quills, instead of hardened keratin, were now crystalline filaments, shimmering with trapped psychic energy, occasionally sparking with violet fire. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, glowed with an eerie, multi-hued light, seeing realities that no Kroot was ever meant to perceive. Their bodies, gaunt and skeletal, seemed to float slightly above the ground, their movements ethereal and unnatural. They were no longer flesh and blood in the traditional sense, but beings woven from instinct, sorrow, and raw psychic power. Shamanak, miraculously still alive, was the most coherent of the survivors, though his mind was a shattered mosaic of Kroot logic and Eldar despair. His right arm was a grotesque growth of crystalline bone, his quills pulsed with a chaotic violet, and his eyes wept streams of faint, shimmering energy. He staggered towards the lingering vortex that contained Kalor's essence, his mind, attempting to reach out, to understand what had become of their shaper. The vortex responded, not with a voice, but with a torrent of raw, unfiltered thought, a cacophony of cosmic wisdom, ancient grief, and Kroot hunger, all compressed into an unbearable mental shriek. Shamanak recoiled, his mind momentarily overwhelmed. But through the chaos, he perceived Kalor's consciousness, not as an individual entity, but as a vast, encompassing intelligence, a being of pure prescience that contained the echoes of the Farseer, the sorrowing heart, and every Kroot ancestor Kalor had ever assimilated. Kalor had achieved his ultimate evolution, but he had ceased to be Kalor. He was now something else entirely, a living paradox, a fragment of godlike power trapped within the webway. The Drukhari, despite their surprise at the Kroot's suicidal ritual, were now sweeping through the chamber. Archon Malkarian, his face a mask of avarice and cruel curiosity, surveyed the scene. He had lost many of his witches and warriors, but the prize was before him. The surviving Kroot, though formidable in their corrupted state, were few and clearly disoriented. Their forms were fascinating, a testament to what his coven could achieve if they could only get their hands on such subjects. He ordered his forces to capture the remaining Kroot, particularly Shamanak, whom he correctly surmised was the most intact and thus the most valuable for study. The Archon himself, with a retinue of grotesque homunculi, approached the shimmering vortex, his dark lances charging, his intention clear, to attempt to contain or even consume the vast psychic power now unleashed. But as Malkarian stepped onto the ethereal platform, the vortex pulsed violently. From its depths, tendrils of multi-hued psychic energy lashed out, not with destructive force, but with something far more terrifying, a wave of pure, unfiltered memory and despair. It was the accumulated agony of the sorrowing heart, amplified by Kalor's assimilation, directed with a chilling, nascent intelligence. Malkarian, for all his dark power, was momentarily stunned. He saw glimpses of the fall, of the emptiness of his own race's soul, of a future so bleak it made even his hardened mind falter. His homunculi shrieked, their minds momentarily overloaded,
their pain-enhanced nervous systems short-circuiting. The surviving Kroot, including Shamanak, responded instinctively, their glowing eyes filled with an ancient sorrow fixed on the Drukhari. Their crystalline quills crackled, and with a collective, silent effort, they unleashed their own, newly acquired psychic abilities. It was not a directed attack, but an outpouring of raw, unrefined psychic energy, a defensive backlash imbued with the sorrow of the sorrowing heart and the feral instincts of the Kroot. The Drukhari, caught between the vortex's onslaught and the Kroot's unexpected psychic assault, found themselves in a unique predicament. Their souls, already fragile and starved, recoiled from the sheer despair radiating from the vortex and the Kroot. Many fell, clutching their heads, their minds screaming, their bodies racked by phantom pains. Seeing his opportunity, Shamanak, his voice a raspy whisper of alien words, motioned to the remaining Kroot. They understood. This was not a battle for victory, but for escape. The warsphere, though damaged, was still operational. They fought their way back, a horrifying, ethereal procession, cutting a path through the disoriented Drukhari with psychic-infused blows. Malkarian, recovering from the psychic shock, roared in frustration. But the Kroot were too fast, too ethereal. They melted back into the warsphere, and with a final, shuddering surge of power, the ancient vessel lifted off, vanishing into a shimmering aperture Kalor's residual prescience had opened, leaving behind a devastated chamber, a defeated Archon, and the pulsing, terrifying vortex of Kalor's new existence. The kindred of Kul was forever changed, no longer Kroot, but something else entirely, adrift in the webway. The kindred of Kul, or what remained of it, vanished into the labyrinthine depths of the webway, leaving behind a baffled and enraged Archon Malkarian. Their escape was not a victory, but a prolonged, agonizing transformation. The Kroot warsphere, its hull now shimmering with ethereal light, drifted aimlessly for a time, a ghost ship piloted by beings who were more spirit than flesh. The vortex that had once been Kalor pulsed eternally in the vast chamber where the sorrowing heart had resided. It became a permanent fixture, a singularity of psychic power and profound despair, a living monument to the Farseer's dying curse and the Kroot's insatiable hunger. It was neither sentient in a conventional sense nor inanimate. It was a vast, all-encompassing consciousness, a fractured mirror of the galaxy's sorrows trapped within the webway. It was Kalor, yet it was not. It was the ultimate expression of Kroot evolution, but at the cost of its very Kroot identity. The remaining kindred, led by the shattered Shamanak, became its acolytes, its extensions. Their forms were now utterly ethereal, their skin almost transparent, their crystalline quills radiating a faint, multi-hued glow. They no longer ate physical biomass, for their digestive systems had atrophied. Instead, they subsisted on the residual psychic energies of the webway, or the fleeting emotional echoes they could drain from passing, unfortunate beings caught in their path. Their minds were irrevocably bound to the Kalor vortex, receiving fractured visions and impulses that guided their movements, their hunts. They became a haunting legend, a cryptic entity that occasionally surfaced from the deepest, most desolate parts of the webway. They would appear like spectral raiders in the dark corners of the galaxy, their ghost-like warsphere manifesting with disturbing unpredictability. They would engage with unfortunate ships or isolated outposts, not with the intent of conquest or traditional predation, but to harvest psychic energy, to consume raw emotion, to feed on despair and forgotten pain. They would abduct psychers, not to kill them, but to siphon their mental energies, leaving them hollowed husks. They would raid ancient Eldar ruins, not for relics, but for the psychic echoes trapped within spirit stones, or the lingering sorrow of a forgotten shrine.
Their ultimate purpose remained a mystery, even to themselves. They were driven by an eternal hunger, not for physical sustenance, but for psychic validation, for the consumption of echoes. Perhaps the calor vortex, ever expanding its fragmented prescience, was forever seeking other sorrowing hearts, other fragments of lost divinity, other sources of cosmic grief to assimilate, to complete its unimaginable evolution. Perhaps it was merely driven by the Farseer's dying mission, forever attempting to cleanse the webway of its most painful anomalies, but through the grotesque lens of Kroot consumption. Their encounters with other races were brief and terrifying. Eldar corsairs whispered tales of spectral Kroot raiders that moved like phantoms, their attacks leaving psychic scars rather than physical wounds. Drukhari patrols, particularly those from the Coven of the Bleeding Veil, learned to dread their appearance, for they were hunted not for their flesh, but for their exquisite anguish. Human navigators and astropaths caught glimpses of their ghost ship in the warp, their minds recoiling from the sheer despair that emanated from its crew, speaking of them as the Whispering Shades, or the Sorrow Eaters. The kindred of Kul, a lineage once proud and pragmatic, was now a grim testament to the horrors of the galaxy, a living paradox of Eldar foresight and Kroot hunger. They were no longer loyal to the Tau, no longer part of the Kroot collective, no longer bound by any conventional reality. They existed in the shadows between worlds, in the psychic currents of the webway, a new, terrifying predator evolved for an unimaginable diet. Their legacy was not one of glory or infamy, but of an eternal, insatiable hunger for the echoes of pain, a horrifying consequence of pushing the boundaries of assimilation in a universe where hope was but a flickering candle in an endless night. They were the children of the sorrowing heart, forever lost, forever hungry, forever wandering the psychic labyrinth of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy.